So we've already discussed the major compromises prior to the Civil War because of the competition developing between free and slave states and the balance of power in the Senate. So we learned about the Missouri Compromise in 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all three of which were meant to avoid violent conflict between the North and South. However, conflict developed anyway. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which promoted popular sovereignty in the territories as they became states, Bleeding Kansas came about. John Brown and his abolitionist followers flowed into Kansas to stuff the ballot box, as did slave owners. This led to violent conflict in which John Brown murdered slave-owning families. Further conflict happens when Harriet Beecher Stowe's book Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes a widespread read. Dred Scott sues his owner in court, and a controversial decision handed down by the Supreme Court fans the flames of conflict. John Brown and his abolitionist followers attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in hopes of inciting a slave revolt. And then finally, the election of Abraham Lincoln. All of this leads to the breakup of the Union, which is today's presentation. Our last presentation left off with the Whig Party declining and collapsing. The Republican Party filled that void. The reason the Whigs had collapsed, if you remember, was because they were refusing to take a stance on slavery. They thought this would help them appeal to both the North and the South. However, it alienated the North and the South. Northerners wanted to hear abolitionist views, and Southerners wanted to hear pro-slavery views. The Republican Party was very strong in the North and in the West, but it was seen in the South as the anti-slavery party. And the reason for that is because the first part of their party platform included containing slavery, preventing it from spreading into Western territories. Republicans didn't necessarily want to end slavery or attack it where it existed, but they did want to prevent its spread. They also supported high tariffs to encourage northern industry, and they supported the building of a transcontinental railroad to spur economic growth. John C. Fremont puts up a very good showing in the 1856 presidential election, proving that the Republican Party was now a major force in American politics. This is John C. Fremont. He's the first Republican to perform well in a national election. Abraham Lincoln. He's born and raised in the Midwest, in Indiana and eventually Illinois. He's a self-taught lawyer, having taught himself to read as a child, and he starts out as a member of the Whig Party. Lincoln ran for the Illinois Senate seat held by famous Democrat Stephen Douglas, which led to the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas was forced to defend his stance on popular sovereignty in the territories. Remember, it is Douglas who wrote the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln attacks popular sovereignty, saying slavery was wrong and should not be permitted to expand. This leads to his famous "House divided against itself cannot stand" speech. Lincoln loses to Douglas because the Democratic-held state legislature of Illinois was responsible for electing senators in 1858. Had today's modern direct election of senators by the people been used, Abraham Lincoln very well may have won. This is Abraham Lincoln when he was very young and a Whig Party member and supporter. The election of 1860. Lincoln wins the Republican nomination, and Stephen Douglas wins the Democratic nomination. But Southerners demand a pro-slavery candidate. So Douglas would represent Northern Democrats, and John Breckinridge of Kentucky would represent Southern Democrats. A fourth candidate, John Bell, represented a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party. The results were that Lincoln won in a very split election. Had Breckinridge not broken from the Democratic nomination, and had Bell not run under the Constitutional Union Party, it is quite possible, quite likely in fact, that Stephen Douglas would have defeated Abraham Lincoln, slavery would have been safe for at least another 4 years, and the Civil War would likely not have broken out. Lincoln really only chatted with friends on Election Day and refused to outwardly show his stress over the election results, but was relieved when he learned that he was the new president. The North and the South had long been divided morally. Northerners supported a strong central government, while Southerners believed in states' rights. The industrial North preferred high tariffs to protect their businesses from foreign competition, while Southerners didn't benefit and rejected them. Lastly, but most importantly, the North opposed slavery, while the Southern way of life completely depended on it. Some states were hesitant to secede because they knew it meant war. However, when the votes for or against secession were held, an overwhelming majority wanted to secede. If you look at this map in the upper left, the red represents states that remained in the Union. The blue represents states that seceded between Lincoln's election as president and the fall of Fort Sumter, which we will talk about in a moment. The gray represents states that seceded after the fall of Fort Sumter. And the bluish-green color represents border slave states that did not secede. This includes Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. These are all slave states, but they chose not to secede from the Union. If you look at the lower right, the vote on secession in the South, you can see where the most coloration is the lightest gray color. These were votes for secession. Extremely dark black coloring shows a vote against secession, and then the slightly darker gray color shows a divided vote over secession. Throughout the 1850s, it's really weak presidential leadership and congressional leadership that did absolutely nothing to try to resolve the issue of slavery that leads to civil war. They only really kicked the can down the road, if you've heard of that phrase, for future leaders to have to deal with. Some events that aggravated the divisions. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin, which becomes a bestseller. In 1856, John Brown's crimes in Kansas are committed, and John C. Fremont performs well in the presidential election. In 1857, the Dred Scott v. Sanford court case spurs controversy. In 1859, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia takes place. And in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. States begin to secede, and war breaks out. This cartoon, I made it depicting presidents kicking the can of slavery down the road for someone in the future to have to deal with. Finally, Abraham Lincoln is saying, I don't like kick the can, which leads to the man from Merv's Manure and the man from Sam's Fan to come around the corner and bump into each other. Hence, the poop hits the fan, and civil war breaks out. There is one last attempt at compromise. The Crittenden Compromise is proposed by John Crittenden, a member of Congress. He proposes that the 36-degree, 30-minute latitude line from the Missouri Compromise in 1820 is reestablished. He also proposes that once a territory is eligible to become a state, that popular sovereignty could be used upon statehood. Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans rejected the proposal, making war very likely. Then comes the story of Fort Sumter. Secession didn't necessarily have to mean war. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was demanded to be surrendered to the Confederacy by federal troops stationed there. Abraham Lincoln not only refused, but even sent resupply ships. He promised that these ships did not have weapons or munitions, only food supplies. However, Southern guns still bombarded and took the fort by force, officially starting the war. A famous quote from partway through the war, Robert E. Lee's famous Lieutenant General James Longstreet says, "We should have freed the slaves, then fired on Fort Sumter." His sentiments were that if the war was truly about states' rights, you had to take slavery out of the equation. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. Make sure to use your notes. This way you can score very well. If you do use your notes, there's no reason you can't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.